You consume it daily. You go through more than you probably realize. You are literally made of it. But how much do you really know about water? Join me, Lake Storywater, and my droid, H2O, as we travel in search of the science behind water and water-related concepts. This is Story of Water. Although the Edmund Fitzgerald is by far the most famous Great Lakes shipwreck, there are many other shipwrecks with fascinating tales to tell. Here is a summary of some other noteworthy shipwrecks from each of the Great Lakes. Lake Huron has its own eerily similar wreck to the Edmund Fitzgerald. On November 29, 1966, the 603-foot Daniel Morrell was traveling the waters near Point Aubarks on Michigan's Lower Peninsula when it became caught in a storm with 70-mile-per-hour winds and waves of 25 feet. As the storm continued to batter the ship, it became apparent to the crew that the ship wouldn't make it. Some crew jumped to their deaths into the icy waters whose temperature was just slightly above freezing, while 4 others loaded a life raft and waited. The hope that some of the crew must have felt upon seeing what first appeared to be another ship quickly turned to horror when they realized that it was actually the rear of their own ship that had already broken off and was to collide with them. The ship broke up and sank quickly after this. It would be 40 hours before the life raft was found by another ship. The freezing weather had taken its toll, however, as only one of the original 4 in the raft survived. The lone survivor, 26-year-old watchman Dennis Hale, was found wearing nothing but boxer shorts, a life jacket, and a coat. The Morrell now rests 220 feet below the surface, with the 2 sections of the ship spread about 5 miles apart. The wreck of the city of Bangor is more notable for what happened after the wreck, although the crew's survival story is just as interesting. The 445-foot city of Bangor was loaded with 248 new Chrysler automobiles and heading to Duluth from Detroit on November 30th, 1926. A severe Lake Superior winter storm caused the city of Bangor to run aground near Keweenaw Point on Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The weather was so cold that the ship became encased in ice. The crew of 29 men used a lifeboat to evacuate the ship and were able to reach the shore. However, the spot where they reached shore was nothing but snow-covered wilderness and 15 miles from the nearest village. Some men decided to try to walk to the village, but became disoriented in the thick forest and decided to return to their camp. The crew was able to start a fire, but lacking proper clothing for the sub-freezing temperatures, they were in desperate shape. The men had to stay awake and keep moving in order to avoid hypothermia. The next day, on the brink of exhaustion, the men were welcomed by the sight of a U.S. Coast Guard rescue vessel that was carrying crew from another shipwreck, the Thomas Matham. The rescue ship dropped off the crew it previously rescued and came back for the city of Bangor's crew. Many of them had to be hospitalized with frostbite and other concerns, but they all survived. Back to the cargo. Of the 248 automobiles, only 18 were lost to the sea. The rest remained in excellent condition in the cargo hold of the ship. Once the water around the ship froze solid for the winter, a ramp was built to allow the automobiles to be driven off the ship and over the frozen waters of Lake Superior. Since the area of the wreck was 15 miles from the nearest village, the automobiles had to be driven over the ice along the shoreline to the village of Copper Harbor. Once they made it to the village, they were stored for the winter since no roads were passable for automobiles in this remote area. Once the spring thaw came, the automobiles were driven to another town with access to the railroad, where they were loaded onto rail cars and shipped back to Detroit for repair and sold again. The worst shipwreck in terms of loss of life occurred in one of the most unexpected ways. The 265-foot SS Eastland was a passenger ship that was docked in the Chicago River on July 24, 1915. Passengers were loading onto the ship to travel to Michigan City, Indiana. The Eastland was a top-heavy ship due to additional lifeboats that were added after construction. The ship had reached its capacity of 2,572 passengers, and with many on the top deck, the ship began to list away from the dock. As more people moved away from the dock, the ship lurched, then rolled completely over onto its side, throwing many topside passengers into the water. Those passengers were the lucky ones, however. Although the river was only 20 feet deep, many passengers who were below deck were either trapped underwater or crushed by heavy furniture falling on them. A total of 848 people ended up dying in this disaster. The most lives lost in the open waters of the Great Lakes occurred in the early morning hours of September 8, 1860, in Lake Michigan. The 252-foot steamship Lady Elgin was returning from a trip to Chicago and heading back to Milwaukee during a gale-force storm. A sailing ship, Augusta of Oswego, was traveling with only a small white light, which the Lady Elgin could not see, when suddenly the Augusta rammed the port side of Lady Elgin, tearing a hole in the ship below the waterline. Since the Lady Elgin's damage was not visible, the Augusta left the scene to get to port, as the captain feared that his own ship likely took more damage. The damage was apparent to the Lady Elgin's captain and crew, however, and they tried frantically to save the ship by throwing as much cargo overboard, including cattle, to get the tear above the waterline. Unfortunately, their efforts were for naught, as the ship broke apart in less than an hour, and most of it sank quickly. It sank so quickly, in fact, that there wasn't enough time for people to get life preservers. Survivors were forced to hold on to any debris that floated. By daybreak, rescuers were able to save about 100 people. A student at nearby Northwestern University, Edward Spencer, was credited with saving 17 lives, but unfortunately he sustained serious injuries that left him disabled for the rest of his life. In total, about 300 people died in this disaster. In 1989, the wreck was discovered at a depth of between 50 and 60 feet off Highland, Illinois. Lake Erie's worst shipwreck occurred in the early morning hours of June 17, 1850. The 193-foot steamship G.P. Griffith had left Fairport, Ohio, and was about 2 miles from there when sparks began shooting up near the smokestacks. The captain decided to head toward shore, but as the ship sped up, the sparks quickly became flames. Passengers gathered in the front of the ship away from the flames, and the ship's course drove it into a sandbar in 8 feet of water, about a half-mile from shore. The flames quickly engulfed the entire ship, forcing everyone to jump into the water. One crewman was able to swim to shore and find a small boat he used to rescue some passengers. Although the exact number is unknown, since the ship's records were destroyed, between 240 and 290 passengers died, and only between 30 and 40 survived. This made it the third highest loss of life on a Great Lakes shipwreck. The oldest shipwreck ever found on the Great Lakes isn't even an American ship. The HMS Ontario was an 80-foot British warship with 22 guns that sailed on Lake Ontario during the Revolutionary War. At the time, it was the largest British ship on the Great Lakes. It sank in a storm on October 31, 1780, taking about 80 men with her. The wreck was discovered in 2008, relatively intact, at a depth of about 500 feet, somewhere between Niagara and Rochester, New York. Its exact location has not been made public, however, because even though it is in American waters, it is British property and considered a war grave. The holy grail of Great Lakes shipwrecks is said to be the Griffin. The Griffin was the first bark on the Great Lakes. Basically, it was the first ship larger than a canoe to sail the Great Lakes. The Griffin was built near the Niagara River in present-day New York. The ship was the project of famous French explorer René Robert Cavelier Sieur de La Salle, or just La Salle. He needed a sturdy ship for exploring the waters above Niagara Falls. Construction was completed in 1679. Then on August 7th, the ship left on its maiden voyage. LaSalle and the Griffin sailed across Lake Erie, then through the Detroit and St. Clair rivers to Lake Huron, then through the Straits of Mackinac into Lake Michigan, until finally reaching Green Bay. Here, the ship was loaded with 12,000 pounds of fur, valued at over $10,000, as well as supplies to build another ship. LaSalle wanted to explore more of Lake Michigan, but he needed to get the furs to market, so he sent the Griffin back on a return voyage to the Niagara River, ordering the crew of 6 men to stop at Mackinac Island to unload the furs. On September 18th, the Griffin departed, and so did LaSalle, who did so by canoe along the shores of Lake Michigan. LaSalle waited for the ship into November, but the Griffin was never seen again. Nobody knows what happened to it, although it was most likely lost in a storm. Where it went down is also a mystery, making it a priceless find if it is ever discovered. These are just a sample of the over 6,000 shipwrecks located in the Great Lakes, each with their own unique story. If you enjoyed these stories and you haven't heard our previous episode on the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, make sure you go back and give it a listen. As always, thanks for listening, and stay hydrated. Lake Storywater here. Are you interested in starting a podcast but don't know where to start? Well, I was in your boat too when I came to Anchor.fm. Anchor has many tools to help you start a podcast. They help record and edit your podcast, they distribute your podcast, and they provide some opportunities to make money as well. And the best part is it's free. So try it today. Download the free Anchor app or go to Anchor.fm to get started. Thanks for joining us on Story of Water. If you liked what you heard, why not subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast provider? Let your friends and family know about it as well. Connect with us and listen directly at www.story-of-water.com. Check out the blog or email us feedback. If you really enjoyed the show, become a Patreon supporter. Just click the donate button on our website. Remember, stay hydrated. See you next time on Story of Water.